Hi students, welcome to another Mr. Ness screencast. Today's aim is reforming democracy, black men and white women. And here are your objectives. Please pause the video, look these questions over, and get ready to copy some vocab and take some notes. In the last video, you looked at the efforts of the Populist Party to expand the political power of poor farmers and reduce the influence that wealthy corporations had over the government. You saw how the populists created new methods of democracy like the referendum that circumvented corrupt politicians and allowed everyday citizens to influence the government. Today, you're going to look at two more groups that sought to expand their political power during the Progressive Era: African American men and white women. Unlike the farmers who made up the Populist Party, neither of these two groups had any voting rights at all. After the Civil War, black men had been guaranteed suffrage by the 15th Amendment. But after the end of Reconstruction and the beginning of Jim Crow, Southern whites took those voting rights away, using violent means like lynching to intimidate black men from exercising their rights. Two activists that fought for voting rights for black men were W.E.B. Du Bois and Ida B. Wells. You already learned about Ida B. Wells. She was a muckraker who published investigative articles about lynching. Both Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois were founders of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The NAACP led protests, funded legal cases, and published its own newspaper in order to advocate for the civil rights of black people, including the voting rights of black men in the South. Unfortunately, these activists had little success in achieving reforms, and it's important to remember that despite the progress made for some groups during the Progressive Era, things actually got worse for black people during this time. As you can see in this graph, voting rates among black men in the South fell rapidly after the end of Reconstruction, and they fell even further during the Progressive Era. That's after 1900. Lynchings remained common during this period too. And a major court case that legalized segregation, called Plessy versus Ferguson, happened in 1896. So for African Americans, the Progressive Era was not a time of progress. Black people in the South would not get their voting rights until much later in the 1960s. The other group that was fighting for more democracy, white women, was more successful. And I say white women because most of the women who led the women's rights movement were outwardly racist, did not allow black women to participate in their movement, and had little or no interest in helping black women get the right to vote. So when we talk about the women's rights movement in America, it was really a movement to gain voting rights for white women. You learned about the women's rights movement last semester. Its goal was to gain women's suffrage, or the right to vote. The women's rights movement began long before the Progressive Era. It started in 1848 at the Seneca Falls Convention in New York, where activists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton created an important document called the Declaration of Sentiments, demanding equal rights for women. As women like Stanton and Susan B. Anthony got older, younger suffragists like Carrie Chapman Catt took up the fight. And the women's rights movement achieved a huge success in 1920 at the very end of the Progressive Era. And that's when the 19th Amendment was ratified, giving women the right to vote. The 19th Amendment. This is an important amendment and one that you should know. The text of the amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." The 19th Amendment meant that the women's rights movement had achieved its goal. Its goal was women's suffrage, and it gained it in 1920 with this amendment. And that's why we say the movement ended that year when the amendment was passed. Before we end, I want to reiterate that although in theory this amendment applied to all women, it only caused a change for white women because black women continued to be disenfranchised in the South even after 1920. Now it's time to review the objectives. Let me go back to them. If you don't know the answer to any of them, just rewind the video and look again. I'll see you in class. Bye, students.